An ordinary flight turns tense. The hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop to the otherwise bustling cabin as passengers settled into their seats. The flight from Atlanta to Chicago promised a straightforward journey, but fate had other plans. Among the passengers boarding was Mara Whittaker, a woman in her late 40s, exuding an air of self-assured superiority. Dressed in a bright designer blouse, her oversized sunglasses perched on her head, she navigated the aisle with a commanding presence, scanning her surroundings as though inspecting her personal domain. Behind her, a composed man in his early 30s, Officer Malik Jefferson, made his way to his assigned seat. His neatly pressed police uniform, adorned with a badge gleaming under the cabin lights, reflected his professionalism and dedication. Malik, known in his precinct for his unshakable calm, looked forward to using this flight to unwind with a good book. Little did he know, his resolve would soon be put to the ultimate test. As Mara reached her row, her eyes fell on Malik, who was seated in the middle seat next to her designated spot by the window. Her lips thinned into a line of visible displeasure as she paused, glaring at him as though he were an uninvited guest in her personal space. "Excuse me," she said curtly, making no effort to hide her irritation. Malik stood politely, offering a polite nod as he stepped into the aisle to let her pass. "Of course, ma'am. Please take your seat." Mara slid into her seat, mumbling under her breath as she shoved her handbag into the space between them. Malik chose not to engage, instead focusing on the novel in his hands. He hoped the 2-hour flight would pass uneventfully, but the subtle tension in the air hinted otherwise. The snide remarks begin. As the plane reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign turned off, Mara's muttered comments grew louder. She looked Malik up and down, her gaze filled with disdain. "I don't understand why they let just anyone on these flights these days," she muttered, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Malik glanced up from his book, meeting her gaze briefly before returning to his reading. He decided to stay silent, knowing from experience that engaging would likely escalate the situation. But Mara wasn't satisfied with his silence. "You know," she continued, her voice laced with condescension, "some people just don't understand how to behave in public spaces." The comment hung in the air, drawing glances from passengers seated nearby. Some exchanged uncomfortable looks, while others shifted in their seats, unsure whether to intervene. Malik took a deep breath and let it go. Years of experience on the force had taught him the value of restraint. The confrontation escalates. As the flight attendants began their beverage service, Mara seized the opportunity to amplify her provocations. She called for the attendant with exaggerated urgency, ensuring she was the center of attention. "I'll have sparkling water," she said, her tone icy. "And make sure it's cold. I don't want whatever lukewarm nonsense you usually serve." The flight attendant nodded politely, her professionalism intact. "Of course, Mom," she replied before turning to Malik with a kind smile. "And for you, sir?" "Just water, please," Malik responded, his voice calm. As the attendant handed Malik his drink first, Mara let out an audible scoff. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Do you always serve people like him first?" The attendant's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her composure and handed Mara her drink. Mara sipped her water, her smirk growing as she glanced sideways at Malik. "You must think you're something special," she sneered. "But let me tell you something. People like you don't belong in spaces like this." The blatant racism in her words caused an audible gasp from a nearby passenger. Malik set his book down slowly, meeting Mara's eyes for the first time. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I'm just here to enjoy a peaceful flight. I suggest we both do the same." "Oh, peaceful." Mara's voice rose, drawing more attention. "I don't feel safe sitting next to you. How do I know you won't get violent?" The accusation cut through the cabin like a blade. Passengers stared openly now, their shock evident. A mother across the aisle pulled her child closer, whispering reassuring words. Malik's calm demeanor didn't waver. "I assure you, ma'am, "I'm not a threat to you or anyone else here," he said. But Mara wasn't ready to back down. "That's exactly what people like you always say," she snapped, her voice filled with venom. Support from the crowd. By now, the situation had captured the attention of the entire cabin. An elderly man seated a few rows ahead turned around, his face stern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm, "you're the only one here making anyone uncomfortable. Leave the officer alone." Others murmured in agreement, and a young woman across the aisle offered Malik an apologetic smile. Mara's face reddened, her indignation growing as she realized the tide was turning against her. "You all have no idea what you're talking about," she hissed. "I have every right to express my concerns." A flight attendant approached, her expression tense. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice and remain seated," she said. Mara crossed her arms, fuming silently as the attendant walked away. Malik returned to his book, his patience tested but intact. A moment of reflection. As the plane began its descent, Mara's energy seemed to wane. She glared at Malik one last time, her voice a venomous whisper. "You might think you've won this time, but don't forget, you're nothing without that uniform." Malik met her gaze calmly, her words rolling off him like water off a stone. He knew who he was, and no amount of hatred could shake his sense of self. The plane landed smoothly, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Mara hurried off the plane, her head held high as though she had claimed some invisible victory. Malik stayed seated, allowing the cabin to empty before he stood. As he exited the plane, a young boy approached him with wide eyes. "Are you a police officer?" the boy asked shyly. Malik crouched down to the boy's level, offering a warm smile. "I am," he said. "I help keep people safe." The boy's mother nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for your patience," she said quietly. Malik straightened, his resolve renewed. Mara's hatred had tested him, but the kindness of strangers reminded him of the good in the world. Little did he know, his encounter with Mara was far from over. The calm before the storm. After the tense encounter on the plane, Malik was relieved to step off and breathe in the slightly stale yet familiar air of the airport terminal. The sprawling concourse buzzed with activity as travelers hurried to their gates, dragging suitcases and balancing cups of overpriced coffee. It was the kind of chaos Malik found oddly comforting. As a police officer, he was used to observing the nuances of human behavior in crowded spaces, and airports were a goldmine of it. Families reuniting, business professionals pacing with Bluetooth headsets, and tourists marveling at their surroundings. Malik adjusted his carry-on bag on his shoulder and checked his phone for messages. His sister had sent a photo of her new puppy, and a friend had texted him a joke about his favorite sports team losing. It was a welcome distraction from the sour encounter on the flight, and he allowed himself a small smile. Despite the relief of being back on solid ground, Malik couldn't shake the lingering tension from the flight. Mara's parting words echoed in his mind. "You might think you've won this time, but don't forget, you're nothing without that uniform." The sheer audacity of her statement left a bitter taste in his mouth. But Malik reminded himself that her venom wasn't about him personally. It was about her ignorance and whatever baggage she carried. He had seen it before. People projecting their insecurities onto others, needing someone to blame for their unhappiness. That didn't make it right, but it did make it predictable. As Malik made his way to the baggage claim area, he focused on maintaining his composure. Years of training had taught him that dignity wasn't about winning every confrontation. It was about knowing when to rise above. And yet, something about Mara's relentless malice stuck with him. He had encountered hostility before, but hers had been particularly sharp, driven by an almost personal hatred for someone she had just met. Malik wondered if this was the end of their encounter, or if fate had more in store. Mara's next move. Mara, meanwhile, had stormed off the plane with her head held high, determined to regain the control she felt slipping through her fingers. The humiliation she experienced on the flight gnawed at her, a public scene where people had dared to side against her. How could they? she fumed inwardly. In her mind, she was in the right. Malik's calm demeanor had only fueled her anger, making her feel like a fool in front of the entire cabin. As she reached the baggage claim area, she spotted him. Malik stood a short distance away, his posture relaxed yet vigilant, as though nothing had happened. Mara's lip curled in disdain. How dare he carry himself so confidently after what he had put her through? The thought infuriated her, and a plan began to form in her mind. Mara pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll through emails as she kept an eye on Malik. She noticed how the airport staff greeted him warmly, how travelers who had been on the same flight occasionally offered him nods of respect or smiles of gratitude. It made her blood boil. In her mind, Malik wasn't a hero. He was an obstacle, a reminder that people like him were encroaching on spaces where they didn't belong. An unexpected encounter. Malik leaned against a pillar, waiting for the luggage carousel to spring to life. He let his thoughts drift to his plans for the evening, catching up on a new book, maybe ordering takeout, and unwinding after a long day. But his instincts, honed by years on the force, told him to stay alert. The crowd at baggage claim was dense, and while most people were absorbed in their own concerns, he felt a faint prickle at the back of his neck, the unmistakable sense of being watched. He scanned the area discreetly, and sure enough, there she was. Mara. She stood on the other side of the carousel, her eyes locked on him like a hawk circling its prey. Her expression was unreadable, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. Malik sighed internally. What now? He thought. Before he could fully process her presence, Mara began walking toward him. Her heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor, her stride purposeful and unyielding. Malik straightened, preparing himself for whatever confrontation she had planned. "Excuse me," Mara said loudly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal. Several heads turned in their direction, passengers momentarily distracted from their own tasks. Malik kept his expression neutral, meeting her gaze evenly. "Yes, Mom," he said, his tone polite but firm. Mara crossed her arms, her face a mask of indignation. "I want an apology," she declared. Malik raised an eyebrow. "An apology? For what exactly?" "For humiliating me on that flight," she snapped. "You made me look like a fool in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" Malik's patience, already stretched thin, was now on the verge of snapping, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself of who he was and what he represented. "Ma'am," he began calmly, "I didn't humiliate you. If anything, I went out of my way to remain respectful despite your repeated insults." Mara's face turned a shade darker, her anger bubbling to the surface. "You call that respect? Sitting there, acting all smug, making me look like the bad guy." Malik opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice interrupted them. "Is there a problem here?" A security guard approached, his gaze flicking between Malik and Mara. He was a stout man with a no-nonsense demeanor, clearly accustomed to handling disputes in the chaotic environment of an airport. Mara immediately turned to the guard, her expression shifting into one of exaggerated distress. "Yes, there is," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "This man has been harassing me since the flight. He followed me here, and I don't feel safe." The guard frowned, clearly taken aback by the accusation. He turned to Malik, who remained calm despite the gravity of the claim. "Sir, is this true?" the guard asked, his tone measured. "No, it's not," Malik replied evenly. "I haven't spoken to her since we left the plane. She's the one who approached me." Before the guard could respond, a woman stepped forward from the crowd. It was the young mother from the flight, her child clutching her hand. "That's not true," she said firmly, addressing the guard. "I was on the same flight as them. This officer didn't do anything wrong. She's been harassing him nonstop." Other passengers began to chime in, their voices rising in agreement. "He was calm the whole time," one man said. "She was the one causing a scene." Mara's face reddened as the tide turned against her once more. The security guard, now armed with the accounts of multiple witnesses, looked at her sternly. "Ma'am, I think it's best if you move along," he said. "It sounds like you're the one causing the disturbance." Mara opened her mouth to protest, but the crowd's disapproving stares silenced her. With a huff, she turned on her heel and stormed off, her footsteps echoing through the terminal. A moment of solidarity. As the crowd began to disperse, the young mother approached Malik with a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, "for staying calm and not letting her get to you. My son was watching, and it's important for him to see what real strength looks like." Malik nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for speaking up," he replied. "It means a lot." As he finally retrieved his luggage and made his way toward the exit, Malik couldn't help but reflect on the events of the day. Mara's hatred had been loud and unrelenting, but the kindness of strangers had drowned it out. For every Mara in the world, there were people willing to stand up for what was right, and that gave Malik hope. But just as he stepped outside into the crisp evening air, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, his expression unreadable. Malik's instincts flared. Something told him this wasn't over yet. Unfinished business. The crisp evening air outside the airport offered a brief respite from the tense atmosphere Malik had endured throughout the day. Rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness in his neck, he pushed a small wheeled suitcase toward the taxi stand. The sounds of car engines idling and the occasional honk blended into the background as Malik considered calling his sister for a lighthearted conversation to reset his mood. But something about the black SUV parked just ahead caught his attention. The vehicle was sleek, spotless, and oddly conspicuous among the crowd of ordinary cars and taxis shuttling passengers away. Leaning against the driver's side was a man in a tailored gray suit, his posture casual but his eyes sharply focused on Malik. The man's presence felt calculated, his polished appearance and discreet earpiece hinting at a professional role, one that wasn't tied to ordinary airport security. As Malik approached the curb, the man stepped forward, his stride purposeful but unthreatening. "Officer Malik Jefferson?" he asked, his tone smooth and practiced. Malik's brows furrowed. His instincts, honed over years in law enforcement, immediately registered this as unusual. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The man offered a small, tight-lipped smile, extending a hand. "Richard Niven. I work in private security for select clients. I believe you've recently had an interaction with one of them. Mrs. Mara Whittaker." At the mention of Mara's name, Malik's pulse quickened, though he kept his expression neutral. He shook Richard's hand firmly, noting the man's polished demeanor and calm tone. "Is that so?" Malik replied evenly. "And what brings you here, Mr. Niven?" Richard adjusted his tie, the faintest glimmer of discomfort crossing his face. "Mrs. Whittaker contacted our firm regarding an incident on the flight. She's concerned about your conduct." Malik blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of Mara's actions. "My conduct?" he asked, his tone sharpened. "I think the passengers who witnessed her behavior would have a different perspective." Richard nodded, his expression shifting to one of cautious diplomacy. "I'm not here to make accusations, officer. My role is to mediate and ensure my client's concerns are addressed." She felt strongly enough about the situation to request our intervention. Malik crossed his arms, his posture straightening. "If she's upset that I didn't engage with her provocations, that's her issue, not mine. And frankly, I don't see how a private security firm factors into this." Richard held up a hand, his tone remaining measured. "I understand your frustration, officer. Trust me, I've dealt with challenging clients before. Mrs. Whittaker is a prominent figure in her circles, and she's sensitive to how she's perceived. She believes the events on the plane and at baggage claim cast her in an unfair light." Malik's jaw tightened. Unfair light. Her words were blatantly racist, And her actions were intentionally provocative. She harassed me, not the other way around. Richard nodded again, his expression softening. I'm not here to debate the morality of what happened. Frankly, I have no reason to doubt your account. But she's adamant about making this disappear. A veiled threat. Malik narrowed his eyes, studying Richard closely. Disappear. What exactly does that mean? Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Mrs. Whittaker is prepared to escalate this situation if she feels her concerns aren't being addressed. She's considering filing a formal complaint with your department and pursuing legal action. My job is to prevent that from happening. For everyone's sake. The words hung in the air like a thinly veiled threat. Malik took a slow, measured breath. He had faced countless difficult situations in his career, from tense domestic disputes to high-stakes arrests. But this was something different. It wasn't just about defending his actions. It was about protecting his reputation against someone who wielded privilege and entitlement like a weapon. And what exactly does she expect from me? Malik asked, his voice steady but edged with steel. Richard shifted his weight slightly, his polished demeanor faltering just enough to reveal his discomfort. She's requesting a formal apology. Publicly, if possible. Malik stared at him, incredulous. An apology? For what? Existing in the same space as her? For not reacting to her insults and accusations? Richard raised his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not saying it's reasonable, officer. I'm simply relaying her expectations. My goal is to avoid unnecessary conflict. A simple apology could diffuse the situation and allow everyone to move on. Malik's eyes hardened. You want me to apologize for being the target of her bigotry? No, that's not happening. Richard sighed, his professional facade slipping slightly. I understand your position, but Mrs. Whittaker is persistent. If this escalates, she has the resources to make it difficult for you. Malik took a step closer, his voice lowering but gaining intensity. Let me make something clear, Mr. Nevin. I've spent my career serving my community with integrity and fairness. I've handled far worse than Mrs. Whittaker's tantrums, and I won't compromise my principles to appease her ego. If she wants to escalate, she can. But she should know I won't back down. Richard held Malik's gaze for a moment before nodding slowly. I respect that, officer. Truly, I do. But I'm afraid this won't be the last you hear from her. Unintended witnesses. Unbeknownst to Malik and Richard, their conversation had caught the attention of several passersby. Among them was a freelance journalist named Clara Reyes, who had just returned from covering a civil rights rally in Atlanta. Clara, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s, had an instinct for stories that revealed the deeper currents of society, especially those that highlighted injustice. She lingered nearby, pretending to scroll through her phone while discreetly listening to the exchange. The mention of Mara Whittaker's name piqued her interest, as did Malik's steadfast refusal to yield to her demands. Clara's journalistic instincts told her there was more to this story than a simple airport disagreement. As the SUV pulled away and Richard disappeared into the sea of traffic, Clara approached Malik cautiously. "Excuse me," she said, her voice warm but professional. "I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation back there. My name's Clara Reyes. I'm a journalist. Would you mind telling me what happened?" Malik hesitated, weighing the pros and cons of speaking to a reporter. On one hand, he didn't want to draw more attention to the situation. On the other, he sensed that the truth might need a platform larger than the confines of his own department. After a moment, he nodded. "I'll tell you what happened," he said, "but only if you're interested in reporting the full truth, not just the parts that make for a good headline." Clara smiled. "Officer, the truth is exactly what I'm after." A new ally. As Malik recounted the events on the plane and the subsequent confrontation at the airport, Clara listened intently, jotting down notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. She was particularly interested in Mara's attempts to weaponize her privilege and the subtle yet undeniable racism underlying her behavior. When Malik finished, Clara closed her notebook and met his gaze with a determined expression. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said. "I think it's important for people to hear stories like yours." Too often, individuals like Mara Whittaker are allowed to act with impunity because no one challenges them. Malik nodded. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I just want to make sure people like her don't get to rewrite the narrative." Clara smiled. "I'll make sure of it." As they parted ways, Malik felt a renewed sense of purpose. Mara might have intended to use her influence to intimidate him, but her actions had inadvertently shone a light on an issue far bigger than either of them. And with allies like Clara willing to amplify the truth, Malik knew he wasn't fighting this battle alone. But as he left the airport, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mara wasn't done yet. And this time, her next move might be even more calculated and dangerous. The chessboard shifts. Days passed, but the memory of Mara Whittaker's venomous words and her audacious demand for a public apology lingered in Malik's mind. He returned to his duties as a police officer, trying to focus on the work that grounded him, helping his community, mentoring young recruits, and ensuring that justice was served fairly. But the undercurrent of tension remained. Mara's final words at the airport, her promise that she wasn't finished, played in the back of his mind like an unresolved note in a melody. Malik's instincts, honed from years in law enforcement, told him that her threats weren't empty. Mara Whittaker was a woman who thrived on control, and losing it in such a public way would only push her to double down. He just didn't know when or where she'd strike next. The answer came one crisp morning as Malik sat at his desk reviewing a case file. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number, but the area code was local. Cautiously, he answered. "Officer Malik Jefferson," came a voice on the other end. It was clipped, professional, and carried a tone of authority. "Yes, this is Malik," he replied, sitting up straighter. "This is Captain Raymond Lowell from Internal Affairs," the voice continued. Malik's chest tightened. "I'd like to discuss a formal complaint that's been filed against you." The complaint. Within the hour, Malik found himself sitting across from Captain Lowell in a sterile conference room at the precinct. The captain, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, slid a thin folder across the table toward Malik. "The complaint alleges unprofessional conduct during a recent flight from Atlanta to Chicago," Captain Lowell said, watching Malik carefully. "The complainant states that you harassed her and created a hostile environment." Malik exhaled slowly, opening the folder. Inside was a formal statement from Mara Whittaker, written in meticulous detail. Her words painted a picture of a belligerent, aggressive officer who had intimidated her and others on the flight. She claimed Malik had abused his authority and acted in a way that threatened her personal safety. For a moment, Malik simply stared at the paper. The audacity of the lies left him stunned. But as he read further, his disbelief turned to anger. Mara had twisted every interaction into a weapon against him, casting herself as the victim and him as the aggressor. It was calculated, cold, and utterly detached from reality. "This is a blatant lie," Malik said finally, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "There are multiple witnesses who can corroborate my account. Her behavior was unprovoked and hostile, and I did everything in my power to de-escalate." Captain Lowell leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "I'm aware of the witnesses. We've already begun contacting some of the passengers who were on the flight. But you know how this works, Jefferson. When a complaint like this is filed, we have to investigate thoroughly. It's not just about the truth, it's about the optics." The word optics hung in the air like a bad odor. Malik knew what it meant. Mara's wealth and influence gave her the power to amplify her version of events, and Malik's uniform made him an easy target for scrutiny. Even if the truth was on his side, the court of public opinion was a different beast entirely. A community stands up. As the internal affairs investigation began, news of the complaint spread. It started as whispers within the precinct, then trickled into the community. Malik, who had built a reputation as a fair and compassionate officer, suddenly found himself the subject of speculation. Some colleagues offered quiet support, while others avoided him altogether, wary of being associated with someone under investigation. But outside the precinct, something remarkable happened. A few days after the investigation was announced, Malik received a call from Clara Rice, the journalist he'd met at the airport. Her voice crackled with energy. "Malik, you need to see this," she said. "Check your email. I've been working on a story, and it's gaining traction." Malik opened his laptop and found Clara's article waiting in his inbox. The headline read, "The Abuse of Privilege: How One Woman Tried to Weaponize Racism Against a Police Officer." The article was a masterwork of investigative journalism. Clara had interviewed passengers from the flight, including the young mother and the elderly man who had spoken out against Mara's behavior. Their accounts painted a starkly different picture from Mara's complaint. Clara had also uncovered Mara's history, previous incidents where she had used her wealth and connections to bully and manipulate others. It was a damning expose that left little doubt about Mara's motives. By the time Malik finished reading, the article had already gone viral. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #StandWithMalik and #AccountabilityForAll. Prominent figures in the community, from pastors to local business leaders, publicly voiced their support for him. Mara's counterattack. While the article bolstered Malik's position, it also escalated the situation. Mara, predictably, was furious. She appeared on a local news segment, sitting stiffly in an elegant living room adorned with expensive art and gilded furniture. Her voice trembled with practiced emotion as she recounted her ordeal. "This has been a traumatic experience for me," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "I've always believed in the integrity of our institutions, but I can't stay silent when I've been wronged." The interview, which aired during prime time, was met with mixed reactions. While some viewers expressed sympathy, many saw through her performance. Comments flooded social media, with people questioning her motives and criticizing her attempt to paint herself as a victim. One particularly sharp tweet read, "Wealth doesn't buy character, Mara. Maybe try treating people like humans next time." #StandWithMalik. The gathering storm. Despite the overwhelming public support, Malik knew the fight wasn't over. Mara's connections and resources made her a formidable opponent, and the internal affairs investigation continued to loom over him like a dark cloud. One evening, as Malik prepared for another day of work, his phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "We need to meet. There's something you should know." Curious and slightly apprehensive, Malik agreed to meet her at a quiet coffee shop near the precinct. Clara arrived with a laptop and a stack of documents, her expression grim. "I've been digging deeper into Mara's background," she said, opening her laptop, "and I found something you need to see." On the screen was a series of emails and internal memos, communications between Mara and a local politician known for his controversial views. The correspondence revealed a disturbing agenda. Mara and her allies had been working to discredit individuals in law enforcement who they believed didn't align with their vision of order. Malik wasn't just a target of her personal vendetta. He was part of a broader scheme. "This isn't just about the flight," Clara said. "She's trying to make an example of you. If she succeeds, it sets a precedent." Malik leaned back, the weight of the revelation settling over him. He had always known this fight was bigger than himself, but now it was clear just how deep it ran. Mara's actions weren't just about him. They were about maintaining a system that allowed people like her to wield unchecked power. As he left the coffee shop that night, Malik felt a renewed sense of purpose. The storm was far from over, but he was ready to face it head-on. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced or marginalized by people like Mara Whitaker. And this time, he wasn't alone. The storm breaks. The revelations Clara Rice shared added a new layer to the battle Malik now found himself entrenched in. What began as a targeted personal attack by Mara Whitaker had evolved into a much larger fight, one that exposed a web of influence, privilege, and systemic injustice that Mara and her allies wielded with impunity. Malik understood now that he wasn't merely defending his name. He was standing against something far more insidious. As the internal affairs investigation moved forward, Malik's days were consumed by interviews and statements. Witness after witness from the flight was called in to give their accounts, all of them consistent with Malik's version of events. The support from passengers, community leaders, and strangers who had read Clara's article helped fortify him. But the process was exhausting. At the same time, Mara Whittaker's public narrative continued to unravel. Clara's article had sent ripples through social media and the local news cycle, leading to deeper investigations into Mara's past behavior. People who had once feared speaking out against her now felt emboldened, sharing stories of how she had used her wealth and influence to manipulate situations and silence dissent. Each new account added fuel to the fire, turning the tide of public opinion further against her. But Mara was not one to retreat quietly. If anything, the backlash only seemed to strengthen her resolve. A new front opens. One evening, Malik sat in his modest living room, reviewing notes for his next interview with Internal Affairs. The soft hum of his apartment's heater filled the silence, a comforting counterpoint to the chaos of the past weeks. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with an incoming call from Clara. "Malik," Clara said without preamble, her tone urgent. "You're going to want to sit down for this." "I'm already sitting," he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite the gravity in her voice. "What's going on?" "I just got confirmation from a very reliable source that Mara has hired a private investigator to dig into your past," Clara said. "She's trying to find anything that she can use against you." Malik's smile faded. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Clara confirmed. "And it gets worse. She's also reached out to certain media outlets, offering exclusives if they publish stories painting her as the victim and you as the aggressor. She's spinning a narrative to discredit you, and she's not holding back." Malik's stomach tightened. The idea of someone coming through his life, twisting even the smallest mistakes into ammunition, was both invasive and infuriating. "What do I do?" he asked after a moment. "I can't stop her from lying." "No, but we can stay ahead of her," Clara said. "We need to control the narrative before she does. That means being proactive. I want to do a sit-down interview with you, a full-length piece that tells your story in your own words. Not just about what happened on the flight, but who you are, what you stand for, and why this matters." Malik hesitated. He had always been a private person, preferring to let his actions speak for him. The idea of opening up his life to public scrutiny, even in defense of the truth, was daunting. "Think about it," Clara said, sensing his reluctance. "But don't take too long. Mara's already moving, and we need to act fast." The interview. The following week, Malik met Clara at a small studio rented by her publication. The space was simple but professional, with soft lighting and a neutral backdrop that framed Malik without distraction. Clara sat across from him, her notepad resting on her lap as a camera crew adjusted their equipment. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm and reassuring. Malik nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The interview began with a recounting of the flight, Mara's provocative comments, her attempts to intimidate him, and his decision to remain calm despite her hostility. But as they delved deeper, the focus shifted to Malik's life, his journey into law enforcement, the challenges he faced as a black officer navigating systemic biases, and the moments that defined his commitment to serving his community. "When you joined the force, did you expect to face this kind of challenge?" Clara asked. Malik paused, considering his answer. "I knew it wouldn't be easy," he said. "I've seen racism up close my whole life, so I wasn't naive about what I'd encounter. But I also believe that change starts from within. That's why I wear this uniform, to show people, especially kids in my community, that they belong anywhere they choose to be." Mara Whittaker's words were meant to tell me I didn't belong, but I refuse to let her or anyone else define my worth." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and Clara's eyes gleamed with admiration as she nodded. "What do you hope people take away from this story?" "I hope they see the importance of standing up to injustice, no matter where it comes from," Malik replied. "I also hope they understand that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to stoop to someone else's level." The interview concluded with a sense of quiet resolve. Clara promised Malik that the piece would be handled with care and integrity, and Malik left the studio feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and relief. The aftermath. The interview aired 3 days later, and its impact was immediate. Malik's calm demeanor, thoughtful words, and unwavering integrity resonated with viewers, many of whom took to social media to express their support. The hashtags #StandWithMalik and #JusticeMatters began trending nationwide, drawing attention from prominent activists, journalists, and even a few celebrities. Meanwhile, Mara's campaign to discredit Malik faltered. The private investigator she had hired failed to uncover anything substantial, and her attempts to sway the media backfired as more witnesses from the flight came forward to counter her claims. Her credibility, already on shaky ground, crumbled under the weight of the truth. In a final act of desperation, Mara held a press conference, flanked by her lawyer and a carefully curated group of supporters. But the event quickly spiraled out of control as reporters bombarded her with questions about her past behavior and the inconsistencies in her story. Her polished facade cracked under the pressure, and the image she had worked so hard to project began to unravel. A turning point. The internal affairs investigation concluded shortly after, exonerating Malik of all wrongdoing. The findings, combined with the overwhelming public support and Clara's damning exposé of Mara, left little room for doubt about who was in the right. On a crisp Friday morning, Malik stood before a crowd of community members, colleagues, and reporters at a local park. He had been invited to speak at a rally organized by civil rights groups who saw his story as emblematic of the broader struggle against systemic injustice. As he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of respect and anticipation. "I'm not here today as a victim," Malik began, his voice steady. "I'm here as a survivor of someone else's prejudice, a prejudice that tried to tell me I didn't belong. But I'm also here as a reminder that standing up for what's right is always worth it, no matter how hard it gets." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park. For the first time in weeks, Malik felt a sense of peace. Mara's attempts to tear him down had only made him stronger, and her hatred had been eclipsed by the overwhelming power of solidarity and truth. The fight wasn't over, not for him, and not for the countless others who faced similar battles every day. But Malik knew that as long as there were people willing to stand together, justice would always have a chance to prevail. Victory and vigilance. The rally in the park marked a turning point for Malik Jefferson, but it was far from the end of the journey. The events of the past few weeks had left an indelible mark on his life, reshaping his understanding of resilience, justice, and the power of community. As the crowd's cheers lingered in his mind, Malik knew he couldn't allow himself to grow complacent. Victory in this battle was just the beginning. The fight for systemic change was far from over. That evening, Malik returned to his apartment, a small but comforting space he'd carefully decorated with photos of family, mementos from his travels, and a few awards from his career in law enforcement. As he sank into his couch, exhaustion washed over him. The rally had been emotionally charged, but it also gave him a renewed sense of purpose. His phone buzzed with notifications, texts from friends and colleagues congratulating him on the rally, social media mentions, and emails from people inspired by his story. One message caught his eye. It was from Clara Reyes. "Malik, thought you'd want to see this. Check the attached video. Clara." Malik opened the attachment, and his heart skipped a beat. It was footage from a private meeting between Mara Whittaker and several influential figures. Clara had obtained the video through an anonymous whistleblower. someone clearly fed up with Mara's antics. In the video, Mara's demeanor was cold and calculating, her voice sharp as she laid out her next moves. "I don't care how much it costs," Mara said, her tone dripping with entitlement. "This officer embarrassed me, and I won't let him get away with it. If the public wants a show, I'll give them one." The people around her nodded, their silence complicit. The recording was damning, a clear demonstration of Mara's vindictive intentions. Malik felt a surge of vindication, but also a pang of concern. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence against her, Mara refused to back down. This wasn't about justice for her. It was about control. The legal fallout. The next day, Clara's latest exposé hit the headlines. The video of Mara's meeting spread like wildfire, triggering outrage across social media and mainstream news outlets. Calls for accountability grew louder, with activists, community leaders, and even some of Mara's former allies demanding consequences for her behavior. The fallout was swift. Several organizations that had long supported Mara publicly distanced themselves from her. One of her key financial backers released a statement condemning her actions, and several board positions she held were quietly revoked. It was a stark reminder that power built on entitlement and manipulation was fragile when faced with transparency. Meanwhile, Malik received a call from a high-ranking official at the police department. Officer Jefferson, the voice on the other end, said, "I want to commend you for how you've handled this entire ordeal. Your professionalism and integrity have been exemplary. The department stands behind you." Though the words were reassuring, Malik couldn't ignore the underlying reality. This support had come only after his name was publicly cleared. The system's reluctance to protect him from Mara's baseless attacks from the start weighed heavily on him. Mara's reckoning. Faced with mounting legal and social pressure, Mara Whittaker finally found herself in a position she wasn't accustomed to, vulnerable and isolated. Her lawyers scrambled to contain the damage, but the combination of public outrage and her growing list of adversaries proved insurmountable. The final blow came when Malik, with the encouragement of his supporters, filed a defamation lawsuit against her. The lawsuit wasn't about financial gain. It was about setting a precedent. Malik wanted to send a clear message. People like Mara couldn't use their wealth and privilege to ruin others without facing consequences. The case garnered national attention, with legal analysts debating its implications. Mara's team tried to settle out of court, but Malik refused. "This isn't about a payout," he told Clara during another interview. "This is about accountability." When the trial began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the public. Witnesses from the flight testified against Mara, recounting her harassment and hostile behavior. Clara's articles and the damning video of Mara's private meeting were presented as evidence, painting a clear picture of her vendetta. Mara, once so confident and untouchable, looked visibly diminished as the case unfolded. Her carefully constructed facade cracked under the weight of the truth, and even her most loyal defenders began to distance themselves. The verdict was a decisive victory for Malik. The court found Mara guilty of defamation and awarded damages to him, though he had already pledged to donate the money to community programs supporting racial equality and police reform. For Malik, the true victory lay in the precedent set by the case, a reminder that justice could prevail, even against the odds. The road ahead. In the months that followed, Malik's life slowly returned to a new normal. His story became a rallying cry for those fighting against systemic injustice, inspiring conversations about privilege, racism, and accountability. Clara's continued reporting kept the momentum alive, shedding light on similar cases and advocating for broader societal change. Despite the resolution of his legal battle, Malik knew his work was far from over. He threw himself into community outreach programs, mentoring young people and advocating for reforms within law enforcement. The experience had deepened his understanding of the challenges marginalized communities faced, and he was determined to be a force for positive change. One afternoon, as Malik spoke at a local school about perseverance and standing up for what's right, a young boy approached him after the event. The boy, no older than 10, looked up at Malik with wide, curious eyes. "Officer Jefferson," the boy said, clutching a notebook, "my teacher told us about what happened to you. You didn't give up, even when it was hard. How did you do that?" Malik knelt to meet the boy's gaze, his voice soft but firm. "Because sometimes doing the right thing means standing up, even when it's hard. And I had people who believed in me. People like your teacher, and maybe even you. That's what kept me going." The boy grinned, his admiration shining brightly. Malik felt a warmth in his chest, a reminder of why he had endured everything Mara had thrown at him. Reflection and renewal. That evening, Malik returned home and sat on his balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the challenges, the triumphs, and the lessons learned along the way. Mara Whittaker's hatred had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it had also revealed the strength of his character and the power of solidarity. Her attempts to tear him down had only made him stronger, and her downfall served as a reminder that no one was above accountability. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Malik made a silent vow to continue fighting for justice, to amplify the voices of those who were silenced, and to remain steadfast in the face of adversity. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. And that, he thought, was victory enough.